It was the kind of afternoon parents remember for years, the kind that should have been locked in family photo albums. The park was alive with the sound of children running across open fields, the smell of grilled food hanging over picnic tables, and the soft hum of laughter weaving through the crowd. For families in this small town, the annual summer picnic was tradition. It was safe, predictable. A day no one expected would turn into the one they could never escape. Among the children was a boy of 7. He was restless, excited, the kind of child who couldn't sit still for long. His mother had packed his favorite sandwich. His father had tossed a baseball into the grass, and for a brief while everything felt ordinary. Parents chatted, neighbors shared folding chairs, kids chased each other through patches of clover. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. No one thought to look over their shoulder. The boy asked to run ahead toward the tree line, where other kids had started a game of tag. His parents hesitated, but only for a moment. They could see him clearly, his bright shirt flashing between bodies as he darted forward. It was only a few hundred feet away, the stretch of woods bordering the park. They called after him to stay close, and he shouted back without breaking stride. It looked harmless. After all, dozens of families were spread across the grounds. The area felt too full of life to imagine anything sinister hiding in its edges. Minutes passed. His mother noticed she couldn't see him anymore. At first she brushed it off, assuming he was behind one of the larger trees or had joined a group further up the trail. Parents are used to quick disappearances, children ducking behind playground slides, crouching in tall grass, only to pop out again laughing. But another minute passed, then another. The game of tag carried on without him. And when she scanned the clearing again, he was nowhere. Her voice cut into the laughter around her as she called his name. A few people turned their heads, smiling at her tone of mild frustration. They thought it was just another child wandering too far. But she called again, louder this time, and then her husband was on his feet. Their voices rose, overlapping, carrying across the field. The chatter around them dimmed as more parents caught on. Within moments, the entire mood shifted. Families spread out instinctively, combing through tall grass and shaded paths. Children were pulled back toward blankets as adults began fanning into the trees. His name echoed again and again, bouncing against the silence of the woods. His mother's voice cracked, raw with something more than impatience. She knew. In her chest, she already knew this was not just a boy hiding in play. Something was wrong. Someone called emergency services. Officers arrived within minutes, sirens cutting through the quiet park, lights flashing against tree trunks. They moved quickly, organizing search lines, instructing volunteers to keep within sight of each other. The assumption at first was simple. The boy had wandered off. He was lost somewhere within reach, maybe hurt, maybe scared, but close. Search dogs were brought in, handlers kneeling in the grass with items of clothing pressed to their noses. Helicopters swept overhead as dusk crept in, their beams slicing through treetops. But with every hour that passed, hope thinned. There were no footprints in the mud, no broken branches suggesting which way he had run. The scent dogs circled and stalled, their handlers struggling to find a clear direction. Officers noted how strange it was. Children don't simply vanish without leaving something behind. Usually there are clues. A trail toward water, a piece of clothing snagged on a branch, something overlooked. This time, there was nothing. The parents clung to each other, numb as strangers tried to reassure them. They replayed the moment again and again. He had been right there, just ahead, still visible one second and gone the next. It didn't make sense. The field was wide, the tree line shallow, people everywhere. How could no one have seen what happened? As night fell, the park transformed. Floodlights illuminated the woods, generators hummed, radios crackled with constant updates. The picnic tables still sat covered in half-eaten food, drinks sweating in the heat, as if frozen in time from the moment before everything changed. Volunteers wrapped jackets around shivering children, ushering them into cars while their parents remained to help. Officers questioned everyone, friends, neighbors, out-of-town visitors. They asked for photographs taken that afternoon, trying to spot the boy's last known position. Some recalled seeing him near the trees, others swore he had run toward the creek. None of the stories matched perfectly. With every inconsistent detail, the investigation widened instead of narrowing. By midnight, the once ordinary picnic ground looked like the center of a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off sections of the woods. Evidence teams worked in silence, flashlights scanning over roots and fallen leaves. His mother sat near the park entrance, staring into the distance as if refusing to blink in case he appeared. His father stood beside officers, answering questions he barely processed. Time seemed suspended, each minute heavier than the last. The first night ended without discovery. Searchers returned at dawn, eyes bloodshot, boots caked with mud. More volunteers arrived, strangers compelled to help, their own children held close as they joined the lines. But still, no one found him. The boy who had run ahead toward a harmless tree line had left nothing behind. No trace, no sound, no explanation. And so, what began as a community gathering, a day filled with food, laughter, and sunlight, had turned into something else entirely. A nightmare that spread quickly beyond the park, pulling everyone into its orbit. The disappearance was no longer just the grief of one family. It was a mystery that would grip an entire town, and soon, investigators would begin asking the one question no one wanted to consider. Had someone taken him? The hours after the boy's disappearance turned into a blur of movement and voices. By late evening, the park no longer resembled a place of leisure, but an active search grid. Officers coordinated in sharp-clipped tones, establishing perimeters and assigning teams. Floodlights were positioned along the trails, their harsh glow piercing through the darkness of the woods. Radios crackled constantly, voices layered with both urgency and exhaustion. Helicopters hovered overhead, the thrum of their blades shaking the treetops as searchlights swept across open fields and shadowed ravines. Thermal imaging equipment scanned the forest floor, hoping to pick up the heat signature of a small body lying beneath the branches. Every flicker on the monitor brought a surge of hope, only to be dismissed as an animal or the reflection of pooled water. Hours ticked by, and the screens remained empty of the figure everyone wanted to see. On the ground, search dogs strained at their leashes, handlers guiding them carefully along the tree line. At first, there was confidence. The dogs moved with purpose, circling a patch of grass before lunging forward. Searchers followed, pushing through brush, hearts racing at the possibility of finding something. But then the trail collapsed. The dogs lifted their noses, whined, and spun in circles. Unable to commit to a single direction, they were rescented, restarted, pushed farther in. Again and again, the same result. Nothing. It was as if the boy's presence evaporated the moment he stepped off the field. Volunteers combed every inch of the area, sweeping through the tall grass in tight lines, flashlights bobbing like fireflies across the night. They shouted his name until their throats went raw, their voices carried away by the still summer air. Some crouched to check beneath picnic tables, under brush piles, even inside trash bins, anywhere a child might have crawled to hide. But each search ended with the same chilling silence. Investigators cataloged the absence as much as they did the effort. No footprints matching his shoes were located along the damp ground near the woods. No torn fabric clung to branches. No toy, no piece of clothing, nothing to suggest where he had gone. To detectives, the clean slate was disturbing. In most missing child cases, there are fragments, a trail cut off at the river, a single sock left behind. Here, the earth might as well have swallowed him whole. The lack of evidence led to whispered theories spreading quickly among the volunteers. Some spoke quietly of predators who stalked parks, the possibility that a stranger had been waiting in the tree line. Others clung to the idea of an accident. Perhaps the boy had slipped near the creek or fallen into a hidden ravine, his body concealed beneath branches. And then, more quietly still, came another suggestion. Maybe this wasn't the work of a stranger at all. Maybe someone closer had a reason. Police could feel the tension bleeding into the community. Parents pulled their children close, side eyes cast not only toward the woods but toward each other. Every family at the picnic became a potential witness or suspect, depending on who was asked. Officers began re-interviewing parents, neighbors, even longtime friends. What had they seen in those final minutes? Who had been closest to the boy before he disappeared? The boy's father answered questions with clipped responses, his hands trembling despite his effort to stay calm. His mother sobbed openly, her grief raw, unfiltered. Both swore he had been right in front of them only moments before. But officers, trained to doubt, filed away every inconsistency in tone, every hesitation, every shift in body language. To the parents, it felt like another blow. They were already living their worst nightmare, and now they were being quietly measured against it. By dawn, the search had expanded beyond the park. Roadblocks were set up, vehicles checked for suspicious occupants. Officers canvassed nearby neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a lone child wandering or a stranger behaving oddly. The answer was always the same: nothing. Not a single sighting, not a single detail to move the investigation forward. Detectives gathered back at the command post, slumped over maps and aerial photos, exhaustion painting their faces. They replayed the sequence of events again and again: the boy running toward the tree line, his sudden disappearance, the dogs unable to follow, the helicopters spotting nothing. None of it added up. Children don't vanish in broad daylight surrounded by dozens of people, unless something deliberate had happened. As word spread across town, the picnic disappearance became the only subject of conversation. Grocery store lines buzzed with speculation. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Some offered sympathy. Others whispered accusations. It was no longer just a missing child case. It was a fracture splitting the community down its center. For investigators, the silence of the first 24 hours was devastating. In cases like this, the odds of finding a child alive diminish sharply after the first night. And yet, there was no proof of death, no proof of abduction, no proof of anything. Just a family waiting at the edge of the search zone, praying for answers that refused to come. As the second day ended, one detective muttered a thought he hadn't wanted to say aloud. He said it felt less like the boy had wandered off and more like he'd been lifted straight out of the park, gone in an instant, leaving behind only the kind of emptiness that makes no sense. The others said nothing, but no one disagreed. And with that, the search pressed on. Fueled now by the gnawing sense that something larger than an accident had taken place. The boy's disappearance wasn't just strange, it was unnatural in its precision, and soon suspicion would begin to spread in ways that tore deeper than anyone expected. In the first 48 hours, the search was outward: the woods, the creek, the roads. But when those searches failed, detectives began to turn their eyes closer to home. Experience told them that when a child vanished without a trace, more often than not the answer wasn't hidden deep in the wilderness, it was hidden within the family. They began with interviews. The boy's mother sat trembling in a chair at the station, clutching a tissue that had long since torn in her hands. Her story was consistent. He had been with her, she had packed his food, she had watched him run toward the trees. She swore there was nothing unusual in the hours before. But detectives noted the exhaustion in her eyes, the way grief sometimes blurred details. Every pause, every gap was written down. Then came the father. His history didn't look clean under the fluorescent lights. He had past arrests for minor offenses, nothing violent, but enough to raise suspicion. More pressing were the custody disputes. Friends told investigators that arguments had become heated in recent months, that there were threats of relocation, that resentment simmered beneath every exchange. For detectives desperate to find a motive, it was enough to circle his name in red ink. The community followed that same logic. Neighbors whispered that maybe the boy's father had staged something. Perhaps this was revenge, a way to hurt his ex-wife by taking away the only thing she truly cared for. At vigils, people hugged his mother, but avoided eye contact with the father. Whispers spread faster than facts, and soon suspicion wasn't just a theory, it was a reputation. Detectives leaned into the pressure. They called him back for questioning again and again. They pressed him on timelines, on his movements, on every phone call made that day. He answered, sometimes with anger, sometimes with weary silence. Polygraph tests were administered, the needles sketching lines across paper as he insisted on his innocence. The results came back inconclusive, which for investigators meant one thing: keep pushing. Still, no evidence surfaced. His car was searched, his home scoured, his belongings tested. Nothing tied him to the boy's disappearance. No fibers, no traces, no digital footprint suggesting premeditation. Yet detectives refused to let go. Their belief hardened into obsession. If the boy hadn't been found in the woods, then surely it must have been the father who knew something. The weight of that suspicion crushed the family. Holidays were no longer gatherings but interrogations of silence. The mother clung to her grief while privately wondering if maybe others were right, if maybe she'd been blind to something in the man she once loved. The father withdrew, angry at being treated as guilty without proof. Friends split along invisible lines. Some supported the mother, others defended the father, but no one stayed neutral. The town itself fractured under the strain. Each rumor added another layer to the divide. At school meetings, parents exchanged suspicious glances. At church services, whispers carried through the pews. Some argued that police were wasting time blaming the father while the real culprit remained free. Others believed just as strongly that he was a manipulator who had covered his tracks. The boy's name became less a plea for help and more a battleground for opinion. Weeks stretched on. The case file grew thicker with transcripts and reports, but thinner with viable leads. Detectives replayed interviews late into the night, looking for contradictions they could exploit. They followed up on financial records, convinced they might find a sudden debt or a hidden account. They scoured phone logs, hoping for an unexplained call. But each thread unraveled into nothing. For the family, the suspicion was almost worse than the disappearance itself. There was no chance to grieve together, no chance to unite in hope, because each side was convinced the other might be holding a piece of the truth. At custody hearings that followed, the boy's absence sat in the room like a ghost. Judges listened to lawyers argue about responsibility while the central question, where was he, remained unanswered. The father pleaded publicly for people to stop blaming him, holding press conferences where his anger bled through his words. He said he wanted only to find his son, but his tone, sharp and defensive, convinced some viewers that he had something to hide. His mother's tears, on the other hand, convinced others that she was the true victim, a woman betrayed not just by fate, but by someone she once trusted. By the end of the first month, the investigation had stalled. Detectives had interrogated, accused, and speculated, but they had nothing concrete to show for it. The boy was still missing. The father was still free. The mother was still broken. And the town was still divided, its faith in law enforcement shaken by the lack of answers. In the silence that followed, the case shifted from an urgent search to a lingering wound. Flyers faded on telephone poles. Volunteers returned to their lives. The woods grew quiet again, no longer filled with search teams, but with the echo of what they hadn't found. And yet, beneath that silence, the question remained unresolved. If it wasn't the father, then who? If it wasn't an accident in the woods, then what had happened? Theories multiplied in the absence of truth, and each one drove the community further apart. The disappearance was no longer just about a boy lost in the trees. It was about trust eroded, families divided, and a case that seemed to be slipping further out of reach with every passing day. When weeks turned to months without a single answer, the search for the missing boy slipped from fact into speculation. Without a body, without a ransom note, without even a scrap of clothing, theories began filling the void left behind. And soon, the town became a place where no one could agree on what had really happened. Some clung to the idea of an accident. The nearby river, just beyond the park, became the focus of repeated searches. Divers were called in, scanning its dark waters inch by inch. They dragged hooks across the riverbed, turned up logs, discarded cans, and old tires. But never a body. Still, locals insisted it was the only explanation that made sense. Children had drowned there before, the current was deceptively strong, and maybe he had slipped in unseen. The river's silence, they said, was evidence enough. Others dismissed that idea entirely. To them, the disappearance felt too sudden, too clean. Instead, whispers of something darker began to spread. Human trafficking rings, they said, targeted children at places exactly like that picnic, busy public areas where a child could be snatched before anyone realized what had happened. Rumors spread of vans seen near the park, of strangers sitting too long in their cars. None of it was confirmed, but each rumor hardened into belief for those desperate to explain the impossible. There were people who swore it was planned, that someone had watched the family, studied the boy's habits, and struck at the one moment when no one's eyes were directly on him. They pictured highways carrying him across state lines, a life erased and replaced within hours. The thought made the community feel small, powerless against forces they couldn't even see. And then came the fringe voices, psychics who reached out to the family claiming visions of the boy alive. Some said he was trapped in a basement, others described him overseas. A few insisted he was still in the woods, waiting to be found. Each vision painted a different reality, and each one tore open wounds that were already struggling to heal. His mother listened to them all, desperate for even the faintest hope, while detectives dismissed them as cruel distractions. Every false lead deepened the fracture. A neighbor thought she saw him in a passing car. Another claimed he appeared in the background of a photo from a county fair. Each tip was followed, each lead exhausted, and every time the result was the same: nothing. The disappointment hollowed out the family, drained the investigators, and left the community divided between those who still believed and those who had already let go. The official case file grew thicker with each passing month. Dozens of witness statements contradicted each other. Some swore they saw him by the creek, others near the food tables, others already deep in the woods. The timelines overlapped but never aligned, leaving investigators trapped in a web of confusion. Maps covered in pins and string showed everything and nothing all at once. By the end of the first year, hope was thinning into ritual. The family gathered for vigils, candles glowing at the park's edge, prayers whispered into the night. People still turned out, still held signs with the boy's face. But the energy had shifted. Where once there had been determination, now there was resignation. The crowd was quieter, the faces wearier, the silence heavier. Detectives admitted privately that the case was stalled. Without physical evidence, without a clear direction, they had little more than theories. Each new detective assigned to the file brought fresh energy, but eventually the same exhaustion. The boy's face lingered on posters and milk cartons, but the calls to the tip line slowed, the headlines moved on, and the town returned to its routines with a wound that never closed. For the family, the absence was unrelenting. Holidays passed with an empty chair. Birthdays were marked with photos that didn't age. His mother left his bedroom untouched, while his father fought to convince anyone who would listen that he hadn't been involved. Theories had consumed the town, but they hadn't brought the boy home. And that was the hardest truth of all. No matter how many explanations were offered, no matter how many stories filled the silence, the reality remained the same. A child had vanished from a crowded park, and no one knew how or why. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, but for this family, it never disappeared. The boy's absence stretched from days to months, and from months into years, until the case felt less like an active investigation and more like an open wound. With each season, the search faded a little further from public urgency, replaced instead by ritual. Every year on his birthday, candles flickered at the edge of the park where he had last been seen. Dozens of people gathered, neighbors, classmates, sometimes strangers who barely knew the family but felt pulled by the tragedy. Photographs of him as a smiling 7-year-old were placed at the center, framed by flowers and stuffed animals. For a few hours, the community remembered him, and then, just as quickly, life moved back into its steady rhythm, leaving his mother alone with the silence that always followed. She refused to leave town. For her, moving away felt like erasing him completely, as though his memory were tied to the soil beneath her feet. She kept his bedroom exactly as it had been on the morning of the picnic, the sheets tucked, the toys neatly stacked, the baseball glove resting near the window. It was a shrine, one she dusted carefully, refusing to let time swallow what little she had left. Detectives came and went. Each time a new investigator was assigned to the case, there was a spark of energy, a sense that maybe fresh eyes would see what others had missed. They flipped through hundreds of pages of transcripts, re-examined old photographs, revisited the timeline from that day. For a brief while, hope would return. But eventually, each detective reached the same wall. The evidence simply wasn't there. And one by one, they moved on. Some officers admitted privately that the case haunted them. A child vanishing without trace was rare, even in the most complex investigations. Usually, something broke. an overlooked witness, a clue in storage, a confession from someone caught on a different crime. But here, nothing cracked. It was as though the boy had been lifted out of the world entirely, leaving behind no shadow, no sign, no trail. Over time, the story of his disappearance transformed from an active case into a kind of folklore. Parents told their children about the boy who vanished at the picnic, warning them not to wander near the woods. Teenagers whispered about him during late-night drives, daring each other to visit the park where it happened. The case had become local legend, retold with fragments of truth and layers of myth until no one could quite separate fact from rumor. The family carried a different burden. His mother walked the park trails often, pausing at the tree line where she had last seen him. Sometimes she spoke softly into the silence, asking him to come home. Sometimes she just stood there, watching the shadows. His father withdrew into his own corner of grief, his reputation still scarred by years of suspicion. The accusations had never been proven, but they had never disappeared either. For him, every glance from a neighbor carried judgment. Every interaction felt like a reminder of what people thought he had done. The years that followed marked milestones that should have belonged to the boy. Birthdays came and went with no candles blown out. First days of school were observed only in imagination. The idea of him growing older became painful. His mother couldn't picture him as a teenager, because in her mind, he was still 7, still running toward the tree line, still wearing the bright shirt she could never forget. By the 12th year, the case file was thick but stagnant. Boxes of evidence sat in storage, collecting dust, while the boy's photo still hung on the corkboard in the detective bureau, faded around the edges. Newer cases had taken priority, fresh tragedies demanded attention, but his disappearance remained a quiet reminder of failure. It wasn't solved, but it wasn't forgotten either. It simply lingered, suspended in the same silence that had followed since the first night. For the town, it was another tragedy added to a list of unsolved mysteries that haunted law enforcement. But for the family, it was everything. Their lives had been measured in years since he vanished, and no amount of time, no number of vigils had been able to answer the only question that mattered. Where had he gone? 12 years had passed, and for most in the department the case had faded into the background, one more unsolved file stacked on a shelf. But when a new detective was assigned to the cold case unit, he pulled the boy's disappearance from storage. He had a reputation for patience, the kind of investigator who noticed small details others dismissed. And as he read through the thick file, he felt the same discomfort that had haunted those before him. Children don't simply vanish without leaving a trace. He began with the transcripts. Hundreds of pages of interviews, notes scrawled in margins, timelines carefully drawn. Most had been reviewed countless times, but the detective forced himself to read every word slowly, as though encountering it for the first time. He wanted to see not just what was written, but how it was said, where hesitation lingered, where memory slipped. One statement caught his attention. It came from a man who had attended the picnic, a volunteer searcher who had insisted he saw the boy chasing a balloon near the tree line just before the disappearance. At the time, investigators had written it down without much weight, one of many conflicting reports. But something about it felt wrong to the detective. He cross-referenced the claim with weather records. That afternoon had been still, with no reports of balloons at the park. Photographs from the picnic, dozens submitted by families hoping to help, showed food tables, children running, blankets spread across the grass. Not a single balloon appeared in any image. The detail didn't fit. The detective leaned back in his chair, staring at the line in the transcript. It wasn't just the balloon. It was how firmly the man had insisted on it, how he repeated the image several times, as if trying to anchor the memory in place. To the detective, it didn't sound like someone describing what they had seen. It sounded like someone planting a picture. He dug deeper into the man's background. At the time of the picnic, he had been living only a few miles from the park. He had no criminal record, nothing to flag immediate suspicion. But his name appeared elsewhere in the file, in a list of volunteers who had participated in the early search. He had been there in the days after, combing the woods alongside police, his face blending into the crowd of concerned neighbors. The detective studied this fact closely. Criminals, he knew, often inserted themselves into investigations, using the cover of helpfulness to deflect suspicion. Could this man have done the same, or was it coincidence, one of many locals who felt compelled to help? He pulled photographs taken during the search. In the background of one, partially obscured, was the same man standing near the tree line, arms crossed. In another, he was closer to the search dogs, watching as they circled and stalled. His expression was unreadable. The detective marked the page, circling the man's name in red ink. He knew he didn't yet have proof, only a feeling, a small inconsistency in a story that no one else had thought to challenge. But in cases this cold, sometimes it was the smallest detail that mattered most. He requested the man's original interview tape, replaying it late into the night. He listened to the tone, the pauses, the way the man emphasized the balloon. When asked to clarify where exactly he saw the boy, his answers grew vague, shifting slightly with each retelling. The detective wrote in his notes, "Detail feels manufactured. Why balloon?" It was the first flicker of something in years, a sign that maybe the disappearance hadn't been as clean and inexplicable as it once seemed. If this man's memory was false, then what was he hiding? And why had no one pressed him harder at the time? The detective didn't bring it to the family yet. He knew the danger of stirring hope too early, of reopening wounds without evidence. Instead, he resolved to follow the thread quietly, retracing the man's steps, pulling records, and asking questions others had long stopped asking. For the first time in over a decade, suspicion stirred anew. The disappearance no longer looked like an accident swallowed by time. It looked like something else, something deliberate, hidden beneath layers of false memory and silence. And the detective was determined to find out what. Cold cases live and die in the evidence room, boxes stacked high, each one filled with objects that once carried urgency but had since faded into the dust of time. When the detective requested the files on the picnic disappearance, he asked not only for transcripts and photographs, but for every scrap of physical evidence collected that summer. He believed that if the truth had been missed, it wasn't because it wasn't there. It was because no one had looked at it closely enough. The boxes arrived on a rolling cart, their cardboard edges frayed from years of handling. Inside were plastic bags sealed with yellowing tape, clothes, soil samples, items submitted by well-meaning searchers who thought they might have stumbled onto something. Most were ordinary. A child's water bottle that belonged to someone else, scraps of fabric that led nowhere, footprints too smudged to match. But one bag in particular caught the detective's eye. It contained a small sneaker, mud-caked and faded, tagged as having been found 3 days after the boy's disappearance. At the time, it had been dismissed. Investigators couldn't confirm it belonged to him. There was no DNA, no identifying marks beyond a common brand. Dozens of children at the picnic wore the same style. In the chaos, it had been filed away as irrelevant, but the detective wasn't convinced. He studied the shoe under bright fluorescent lights, rotating it slowly in his hands. Something about the way the mud clung to the sole felt inconsistent. The soil didn't quite match the samples taken from the park that week, and the wear pattern suggested it hadn't been resting outdoors for long. He wondered if the shoe had been placed deliberately, dropped where someone thought it might be found. For most of the last decade, such a hunch would have led nowhere. But forensic science had advanced since the early days of the investigation. Trace evidence that once slipped through analysis could now be studied with new precision. The detective sent the sneaker to the state lab, requesting every possible test: fibers, particulates, chemical residues. Weeks passed, and then the results returned. The findings were small, but devastating. Embedded in the grooves of the sole were fibers that did not come from grass, dirt, or riverbed. They came from the interior fabric of a vehicle, specifically the kind used in older pickup trucks. The lab identified the material as automotive upholstery, distinct enough to suggest that the shoe had spent time inside a vehicle before being discarded. That detail changed everything. The boy hadn't simply run into the woods and disappeared into nature's indifference. The absence of a trail was not an accident of chance. It was the mark of intervention. Someone had taken him. The detective sat with the file open in front of him, staring at the report. For 12 years, the case had been trapped between two competing narratives: an accident in the river or a family dispute that turned deadly. But the shoe told a different story. A vehicle had been involved, which meant abduction was no longer a theory whispered among townsfolk. It was the most likely truth. With that discovery, the circle of suspects narrowed sharply. He returned to the original list of attendees, focusing on anyone with access to a truck matching the upholstery type. Vehicle records from that summer were pulled, cross-referenced against search logs. The names of volunteers, once symbols of community spirit, were scrutinized again, this time under the harsher light of suspicion. The detective thought again of the man who had claimed to see a balloon at the tree line, the one whose detail had unraveled under scrutiny. He, too, had owned a truck that year. Records showed it had been sold just weeks after the boy vanished, transferred quickly out of state. At the time, no one had questioned it. Now, in the context of the fibers, it looked very different. The detective felt the weight of the breakthrough pressing on him. For over a decade, the family had lived in the shadow of uncertainty, torn apart by rumor and suspicion. Now, for the first time, the case had direction, real evidence pointing away from family feuds and toward something darker. He didn't call the mother right away. He knew how many false dawns she had endured, how many times hope had been raised only to collapse again. Instead, he wrote carefully in his notes, documenting every connection, every possible lead this new piece of evidence suggested. The shoe, once dismissed as meaningless, had become the key. The case was no longer about a boy who vanished into the woods. It was about a boy forced into a truck, taken from the heart of a community event, and hidden for reasons only one person could explain. And with each step forward, the detective felt the circle tightening around the one man who had blended into the search, who had stood among grieving families, and who had insisted on a story that never fit. For the first time in 12 years, the silence surrounding the case began to crack, and the question was no longer if someone had taken the boy, but who and how much longer they thought they could keep it hidden. With the evidence pointing toward a vehicle, the detective's focus sharpened on one name, an unassuming neighbor who had once lived just a few miles from the park. At the time of the disappearance, he'd been a familiar face in the community. Quiet, solitary, the kind of man people described as helpful when asked. He had joined the search efforts within hours of the boy going missing, combing the fields and woods alongside dozens of others. He blended in so well that no one ever thought to question his presence. But the shoe fibers changed everything. Records showed that he had owned a pickup truck during that period, an older model with interior fabric matching the lab results. What stood out even more was the timing. Within weeks of the boy's disappearance, the man had sold the vehicle and transferred the title out of state. At the time, officers had noted the transaction but hadn't seen it as unusual. Many people sold cars. But now, viewed in the light of new evidence, the timing looked deliberate, too deliberate. The detective dug deeper. He combed through public records, employment files, and old police reports. What emerged was troubling. Years earlier, neighbors had filed complaints alleging that he had tried to lure children toward his property with offers of candy or toys. None of the reports had stuck. Children's testimony was inconsistent, parents hesitant to press charges without proof. He had never been convicted of anything. But the pattern was there, etched in faded paperwork. There were other red flags. He had been questioned in connection with a missing child case from a nearby county, though that case was eventually resolved without him being charged. He had lived alone most of his life, moving frequently between rentals, never keeping steady work for long. On paper, he looked like an ordinary resident with a thin file of minor issues. In practice, he looked like a man who had perfected the art of appearing harmless. The detective knew suspicion wasn't enough. To move forward, he needed a warrant. He compiled every inconsistency: the false balloon sighting, the quick sale of the truck, the prior allegations. Together, they formed a pattern too concerning to ignore. A judge agreed, granting authorization to search the man's former property, now occupied by new owners, and to review his past residences. As the paperwork came through, the detective considered how easily the man had slipped beneath notice all those years ago. He hadn't avoided the search. He had joined it. He hadn't hidden from police. He had offered his truck for inspection, standing beside them as if he had nothing to fear. It was calculated, the kind of confidence that buys trust, and for 12 years, it had worked. When officers returned to his old neighborhood to re-interview residents, some recalled odd details they hadn't thought about in years. One woman remembered him showing up uninvited at gatherings, hovering near children more than adults. Another recalled how he always seemed to be watching from his porch when kids played in the street. At the time, people brushed it off as awkwardness. Now, filtered through the lens of the boy's disappearance, those memories felt sinister. The man himself had since moved to another state, living quietly under a different job in a new truck. To those around him, he was just another face, another neighbor. But the detective knew that the past had a way of catching up. The fibers in the shoe, the lies in his statement, the truck he sold too quickly, they weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. When the warrant was signed, the team prepared to search. They would start with the crawl spaces, the basements, the hidden corners of the home he once owned. They would pull records from his bank, his phone, his employment, and they would follow every trail the man had tried to bury over a decade earlier. For the first time, the boy's disappearance was no longer an open-ended mystery or a local legend. It had a direction, a name, a suspect who had lived in plain sight and walked freely among grieving parents. And soon, the detective believed, the walls that had protected him for so long would begin to collapse. The warrant gave investigators permission to step back into a place that had been ordinary once, just another small house on a quiet street. Years had passed since the suspect lived there. A new family owned it now, raising children of their own inside walls that had seemed safe. But when the search team arrived, accompanied by detectives and forensic technicians, the atmosphere shifted. The house, long forgotten as a lead, was about to give up what it had kept hidden for more than a decade. They began with the basics, photographing the exterior, mapping entry points, and speaking with the current owners. The family admitted they had always thought the house felt a little odd. The basement was colder than it should have been, and the crawl space beneath the floor gave off a faint smell in the summers. They had chalked it up to age, to poor construction. Now, standing on their front lawn while investigators swarmed through, they looked shaken, as if suddenly aware of the history their home had been holding. Forensic teams moved methodically, peeling back layers of dust and neglect. In the crawl space beneath the home, wedged between beams, they found the first sign that this wasn't just a dead end. A section of the floor had been altered. The wood was newer, smoother, as though someone had patched it years after the original construction. When they pried it open, the hollow space beneath revealed itself, small compartments, deliberately carved out, concealed beneath the foundation. Inside those compartments lay items no one wanted to see. Plastic bags contained children's clothing, some too decayed to identify. There were restraints, old lengths of rope, handcuffs dulled with rust, and then there were photographs, dozens of them, tucked into envelopes. Faces of children stared out from the prints, unsmiling, caught off guard by the lens. None of the photographs had been reported before. Each image carried the weight of years, proof that this man's behavior hadn't been limited to a single moment at a picnic. But the most chilling discovery came in the form of a backpack. It was faded, fraying at the seams, but unmistakable. Investigators compared it against the photographs from the day of the picnic, where the boy had been captured wearing it slung across his shoulders. The match was exact. The same color, the same brand, the same worn strap his mother remembered adjusting before he ran toward the tree line. The room fell silent as it was pulled into evidence bags. DNA testing later confirmed what everyone already suspected. The backpack belonged to him. Fibers on its surface matched his clothing, and traces of his hair were found inside. The discovery shattered any lingering doubts. The boy had not wandered into the woods or slipped into the river. He had been taken, hidden, and erased in plain sight, just miles from where his family had been searching all along. News of the discovery broke quickly. Reporters lined the street, cameras flashing as boxes of evidence were carried from the home. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering in disbelief. Many had lived there during the original investigation. Some had joined the search efforts alongside the very man now under suspicion. The betrayal cut deep. He hadn't been a stranger lurking in shadows. He had been one of them, eating at their tables, waving from across the street, searching shoulder to shoulder for a boy he knew they would never find. For the boy's family, the confirmation was devastating but clarifying. His mother wept when detectives told her about the backpack, clutching it against her chest as though the fabric itself carried a fragment of her son. For years she had imagined him lost in the woods, scared and alone. Now she knew the truth was worse, that he had been pulled into a darkness no one could see, imprisoned beneath the floor of a house where laughter and dinners once carried on above him. The detective who had reopened the case felt the gravity of the moment. This was the break no one else had found, the proof that shifted the narrative from rumor to fact. The man who had spun stories of balloons and joined search parties had been concealing evidence of his crime just beneath his own floorboards, and he had managed to do it for over a decade. Still, the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How long had the boy lived after being taken? Were the photographs of other children victims or simply trophies of obsession? The compartment suggested planning, a methodical mind that had thought ahead about how to hide. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was deliberate, premeditated. The warrant extended beyond the crawl space. Investigators seized old tools, papers, and anything that might connect him to other unsolved cases. But it was the backpack that anchored the truth. It was the one piece that could not be explained away, the undeniable bridge between the boy's disappearance and the man who had lived in that house. As evidence vans pulled away, the town reeled. Parents who had once let their children roam freely now held them tighter. Neighbors questioned every memory of him, the way he stood too close at gatherings, the way he always seemed available when children were nearby. Hindsight turned ordinary interactions into chilling signs. The boy's disappearance was no longer a legend passed around campfires or whispered warnings. It was a crime with a face, a name, and a location. The silence of 12 years had been broken by the discovery hidden beneath a house that should have been safe. And now, with the evidence in hand, investigators prepared for the final step, confronting the man himself and forcing him to answer for what he had kept buried for far too long. The warrant on the house gave detectives the proof they had been missing for over a decade. But evidence alone wasn't enough. The man who had hidden in plain sight had since moved states away, living quietly under the cover of normalcy. He had remarried, worked part-time jobs, and slipped into a new community where no one knew his history. On the surface, he was ordinary. Beneath it, detectives knew, was the weight of a crime that had torn a family and a town apart. Armed with the backpack, the photographs, and the fibers from the child's shoe, investigators obtained an arrest warrant. Officers in unmarked vehicles moved in before dawn, surrounding the modest house where he now lived. He opened the door in confusion, still half asleep, only to be met with handcuffs and the cold recitation of his rights. Neighbors watched from their porches, shocked as the man they thought they knew was led away in silence. At the station, he sat in a small interrogation room, shoulders slumped, eyes darting between the floor and the detectives who confronted him. At first, he denied everything. He claimed the items found in the crawl space must have belonged to someone else. He said he had rented out parts of the house, that maybe someone had planted evidence. But the questions kept coming, steady and precise, until the cracks began to show. Detectives laid out the photographs one by one, the restraints, the clothing, and finally the faded backpack. They slid it across the table toward him, its straps worn thin by years of waiting in the dark. For the first time, he faltered. His breathing quickened, his eyes lingered, and his story shifted from denial to silence. The weight of the truth pressed down, and after hours of steady pressure, he broke. The confession spilled out in fragments, his words halting and cold. He admitted that on the day of the picnic, he had been watching. He had seen the boy break away from his family, running toward the tree line. He had carried a balloon, not because it was part of the picnic, but because he had brought it himself, knowing how easily it could draw a child's attention. He had used it like bait, luring the boy toward his truck parked just beyond the sightlines of the field. He described how quickly it happened. A few words, the promise of something fun, the open door of his vehicle. Within minutes, the boy was gone, hidden in the back seat while his family called his name only yards away. The man had driven off as searchers fanned out in the opposite direction, blending into the traffic of an ordinary summer afternoon. For days, he kept the boy captive in his home. hidden beneath the floorboards in the same crawl space where the backpack would later be found. The boy cried, begged, asked for his mother. The man admitted he had tried to quiet him, but as the story exploded across the media, the pressure mounted. Police were everywhere, roadblocks set up, faces plastered on every news channel. He said he panicked. He convinced himself that keeping the boy alive would only guarantee he'd be caught. In his words, it was a choice made out of fear. In reality, it was an act of calculated cruelty. Within less than a week, he killed the boy. He drove his body to a stretch of remote land where he had once worked odd jobs, a place no one would think to search. There, he buried him in shallow ground, covering the spot with brush and dirt before leaving it behind. For 12 years, the location sat undisturbed, holding the secret that had consumed an entire community. With the confession recorded, officers followed his directions to the site. Cadaver dogs alerted quickly, circling a patch of ground beneath weathered oaks. Excavation teams dug carefully, unearthing fragments that confirmed what the man had said. DNA analysis removed any doubt. The boy's remains had finally been found. The news hit the family with crushing force. His mother collapsed when detectives delivered the confirmation. She had lived 12 years, clinging to the fragile hope that her son might still be alive somewhere, perhaps taken, but not lost forever. Now that hope was gone, replaced by the finality of death. Yet, in that devastation, there was also clarity. She knew where he had been. She knew what had happened. The questions that had tormented her for over a decade had answers, however unbearable. The father, long shadowed by suspicion, wept openly. For years he had been treated as a suspect, his name whispered in connection with his own son's disappearance. Now the truth was clear. He had not taken his child. He had lost him, the same as everyone else. For him, the confession was both a relief and a torment. Relief that his innocence was finally proven. Torment that so much time had been wasted doubting him instead of finding the real culprit. The community reeled. Neighbors who once believed the boy had drowned or wandered off now faced the reality that he had been stolen in front of them by a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with them during the search. The betrayal was staggering. Vigils were held again, not for hope this time, but for closure. People lit candles not to bring him home, but to finally let him rest. The man was charged with abduction, murder, and multiple counts related to the evidence found in his home. In court, prosecutors described him as methodical, predatory, someone who had perfected the act of appearing ordinary while concealing his crimes. He showed little emotion, his gaze fixed downward, as the family gave statements about the years they had lost. After 12 years, the case was closed, not with the reunion the town had once prayed for, but with the cold weight of truth. The boy's family finally knew his fate. A community haunted for more than a decade finally saw the veil lifted, revealing not mystery but horror. And while justice came too late to save him, it came with clarity, a clarity that ended the silence, ended the rumors, and ensured that the man who had hidden among them would never walk free again.